I'm Evelyn Carter, 32 years old, the quiet daughter in a family that never saw me as more than background. And for most of my life, I believed their story about me useful, but never essential. Robert, my father, built Carter Holdings like a monument to himself. My sister Chloe was polished into his golden heir, praised at every dinner, shielded from every failure. I was the shadow at the table, tolerated only when I could make numbers add up. But the night he raised his glass and told a room full of directors that I was useful until I became useless, that was the night something shifted. I stopped waiting for their approval and started gathering proof. Ever been erased by your own family as if you were disposable? Hit like if you've ever been overlooked while someone else stole the credit. Comment if you've been told your silence meant weakness. It all began on Thanksgiving night under the chandeliers of the Carter dining hall, when silver knives gleamed brighter than the smiles around me. I sat straighter than I ever had in that room, no longer the quiet daughter in the shadow of my sister, but a woman who had carried the weight of proof and finally set it down in the center of this table. I sat straighter than I ever had in that room, no longer the quiet daughter in the shadow of my sister, but a woman who had carried the weight of proof and finally set it down in the center of this table. All around me, the family shifted uneasily. Whispers darted between glasses, directors glanced at one another with the unease of men who realized they had bet on the wrong horse. Robert's face had drained of its confident bronze, his jaw set but trembling faintly at the corner. Chloe, dressed in a sheath of gold that now looked gaudy under the heavy silence, clutched her napkin as if it might shield her from the collapse of her carefully curated image. I was born into privilege, I said, my voice steady, carrying to every corner of the room, but tonight proves privilege is not the same as power. Power comes from truth and the courage to show it. My words echoed against the paneled walls. I saw Margaret incline her head slightly, the barest acknowledgement that I had crossed into the territory she had long guarded alone. The documents, the recordings, the witnesses, all the ammunition I had gathered over months were no longer whispers in shadows. They were facts, undeniable, laid bare before the family and the board. Fraud, embezzlement, collusion with competitors, all orchestrated by the very people who once called me useless. Their empire had rested on sand, and I had pulled the tide in. Robert tried to rise to command the room as he always had, but his words faltered, caught in the throat of a man who no longer had authority. "You don't understand," he began, but his voice cracked. For the first time in my life, I watched him shrink, the great patriarch reduced to a man cornered by his own arrogance. The board chair cleared his throat, speaking with a finality that sounded like a gavel. "The evidence is overwhelming. Carter Holdings cannot move forward under this corruption." Effective immediately, the reins passed to Evelyn Carter. "It is her diligence, not deceit, that will preserve what remains." A shiver of murmurs passed down the table. Chloe's eyes widened, then blurred with tears that streaked her perfect makeup. "You can't do this," she whispered, but even she seemed to know the fight was lost. Her hands shook as she reached for Robert's, but he remained frozen, staring into the middle distance as though the empire might reassemble itself if only he refused to look at its ruins. I wanted to feel triumph, but what I felt was something heavier, sharper justice. It did not sing. It thudded in the chest like a second heartbeat. I thought back to that first night when they called me useless at dinner, their laughter cutting deeper than any blade, and I remembered how small I felt under the weight of their dismissal. Now in the same room, I felt the scale tip. The knives still shone, but none were pointed at me. I lifted my glass, not in toast, but in declaration. This family has thrived on appearances long enough. Tonight, appearances shatter. From this moment, Carter Holdings will be built not on arrogance, but accountability. And I will make sure of it. Silence stretched like a taut wire. Then Margaret, calm as ever, raised her own glass. "To Evelyn," she said simply. Others followed reluctant at first, then with the inevitability of people realigning themselves to a new center of gravity. Glass after glass lifted, crystal chiming like bells tolling the end of an era. Robert remained seated, his glass untouched. Chloe dabbed at her eyes, her smile a broken fragment of what it had been. For them, this night was a funeral. For me, it was a resurrection. And as I met the eyes of every person around the table, I felt the truth settle into me. They could strip my credit, mock my silence, call me useless, but they could never take the will that carried me here. Cliffhanger. I already knew whose name he would speak, and it wouldn't be mine. At that table, silver gleamed sharper than knives, and words cut deeper than steel. Thanksgiving in the Carter house was a pageant of control. Candles burned in regimented lines down the mahogany, their flames steady as metronomes. The footmen moved with choreography, learned over generations, setting plates, whose rims were thin bands of gold, laying out knives that shone like a row of tiny scythes. Place cards drew borders more rigid than any treaty. Laughter floated in measured portions, a sound, with edges buffed smooth so no one could be injured unless they were meant to be. Robert rose early in the toasts, amber shining through his glass like trapped sunlight. He spoke of legacy and gratitude, of the burden and privilege of building, of the thrill of steering a ship through uncertain waters. His words were lacquered until the grain of truth vanished. He thanked the team that had made the year historic. Then he turned to Chloe, and the room turned with him as if he had pivoted everyone's chair by invisible strings. "She embodies where we are going," he said, smiling with the confidence of a man who had never been contradicted. Modern, fearless, a visionary. Their applause carried the pitch of obedience. Chloe's cheeks glowed. She lifted her glass with the precise degree of demure triumph glossy magazines call effortless. I tasted nothing. The turkey might as well have been chalk, the wine smoke without fire. From midway down the table, I watched the reflections tremble in the knives. Each bright sliver held a tiny world, the curvature of a glass, a flicker of a candle, the tilt of a smirk distorted just enough to tell you never to trust what you think you see. "Tell us about Henderson," a director prompted, hungry for the story he wanted, not the one that was true. Chloe obliged. She spoke about momentum and synergy, about the buzz among stakeholders, about how the market was ready to be inspired. Her verbs were a bouquet, none of them rooted. She skated past the hard verbs, the ones that bled when you handled them: negotiate, comply, carve out, collateralize. A cousin leaned toward me. "You must be thrilled," he said brightly. "Quite the feather for the family." "For the company," I said, and set my fork down quietly. He blinked, then turned back to where the orbit was warmer. Robert's gaze found me with the lazy speed of a cat's. "Evelyn," he said, lingering on my name like a curiosity in a museum. "You've always had a facility for detail, but leadership isn't spreadsheets." The table chuckled, pleased to be told where to place their mirth. "We need dreamers, people who see beyond the lines. You." He lifted his glass in my direction as if blessing a patient child. "You are a useful dreamer, but sometimes useful becomes—" He let the word fall slow, a coin sinking in water. "Useless." The laugh that followed was not loud. It did not need to be. It traveled like a draft under a door and curled around my ankles. Something in me reached for heat, for the easy flare of anger, and I declined it. Anger is loud, precision is lethal. I looked down at the wine in my hand. Its surface held the chandelier in a broken crown. I could feel the pulse in my palm where the glass stem rested. I remembered a different room, a different year when I'd held my breath, while someone else mispronounced the names of people whose jobs depended on whether I had placed a decimal correctly. I remembered swallowing explanations because explanations are considered indelicate in rooms where the outcome is already written. The Henderson executives were near the head of the table guests with the politeness of people on foreign soil. Linda Park's face was composed into listening. Daniel Ruiz's finger rested on a closed leather folio as if ready to break a seal. I suppose Robert continued, "We'll be hearing some very special news tonight." The rooms sighed the way rooms do when they want to be surprised by something they have already rehearsed. Toasts ricocheted. Gratitude draped itself over grievances until they could not be seen. Someone praised the cranberry relish as if it had done the mergers. Margaret, 3 seats away, watched me with that small surgical attention. She had no judgment, just a composite sketch. I raised the glass slowly, as if my arm weighed more than it used to, and brushed its rim with my lip without drinking. I set it down. The crystal made the smallest sound, a note almost too soft to hear, and yet it seemed to travel the length of the table like a current. Robert's smile thinned. Chloe was still talking about vision boards. I did not clear my throat. I did not ask permission. I aimed my voice the way you set a metronome to regulate, not to excite. If Henderson demands collateralization on the debt swap and invokes a MAC clause who signs off the union carve-out, the room exhaled and forgot to inhale again. Chloe blinked once, twice, like a lens trying to find a focus that did not exist. The word collateralization seemed to hover in front of her face like a moth she could not swat. She smiled too brightly. Our legal partners, of course, will, align with our intentionality. Robert's head turned toward me as if on a hinge. His glare did not ask a question, it issued a warning. Be small, stay graceful, do not embarrass the show. Linda Park set her fork down with care, the tines touching porcelain in a sound that rang cleaner than most words. Daniel Ruiz did not open his folio, and that was louder than slamming it. I kept my eyes on the smooth lake of wine in front of me. If I looked at Chloe, pity might leak. If I looked at Robert, he would take it for challenge. I let the silence do what it was born to do, make everyone measure themselves. A director coughed. Somewhere a candle sputtered and recovered. My cousin studied the cranberry relish as if an answer might be jellied inside. Chloe's smile trembled at the corners the way a bridge quivers in a heavy wind before engineers start doing math. It's a theoretical, she tried, aiming for breezy. We're in conversations that... It's not theoretical, Daniel said finally, speaking voice even. It's in the draft term sheet. He let the sentence sit bare and unadorned like a receipt. Color climbed Robert's neck. This is a holiday, he said pleasantly, an edge of ice beneath the velvet. We needn't drown the table in legal minutiae. I folded my napkin once, a straight seam. Of course, I said, because I had already said what mattered. Chairs creaked. Cutlery lay still, an army awaiting orders. Margaret's gaze flicked to my glass, then back to my face as if to note the method, set it down before you strike. The note again, so soft most people would have missed it, hummed in my bones. Chloe's laugh arrived a fraction late. We're aligned, she said, and raised her glass as if this were a toast. Her hand wobbled. The chandelier's broken crown wavered across the wine surface, and then broke entirely. For the first time in years, they were looking at me not with dismissal, but with unease. Silence is the loudest answer when it exposes ignorance. The words I had released into the air still hung there, hovering like smoke that refused to clear. For a moment, the table itself seemed to lean toward me, the weight of every glass and knife pressing into the polished wood, demanding to know what came next. I gave them nothing. My silence was deliberate, sharper than any rebuttal. Chloe's smile collapsed under its own weight. She inhaled quickly, forcing a laugh that scratched at the edges of her throat. Obviously, Evelyn likes to complicate things, she said, her voice pitched too high, too brittle. She gestured with her fork, nearly scattering a morsel of turkey across her plate. There are processes, teams who manage those clauses. Legal and finance align, and we make sure all contingencies are addressed. Her words fell like loose bricks, one after another, building, nothing covering nothing. She tried again, shoulders stiff. At the end of the day, it's about vision. You can't lead if you're bogged down in technicalities. And that's why her eyes darted toward Robert for rescue. That's why we're positioned to inspire. Robert's glass halted midair. The angle of his wrist was perfect, but his jaw had tightened. He set the drink down with a precision that betrayed control. The Carter family has always valued foresight, he said smoothly, though the heat in his stare struck me like a warning flare. Details are for the accountants and the lawyers. Leadership is about trust, reputation, the long view. That is what Chloe represents. Around him, heads nodded reflexively. Yet the sound of agreement felt hollow, the kind of applause given after a weak performance to spare embarrassment. His words were polished marble, but marble cannot mend a cracked foundation. I caught Daniel Ruiz's reflection in the curve of his spoon. His lips barely moved as he angled toward Linda Park, a whisper meant for no one else. She knows the numbers. The phrase was oxygen in a suffocating room. For the first time, my presence was acknowledged not as decoration, but as threat. Linda's brows lifted a fraction, her gaze sliding toward me as though recalibrating her impression. I lowered my eyes to my plate, letting the turkey cool into inedibility. The stillness in me was not surrender, but strategy. I had already fired the only arrow needed tonight. To speak further would dull its edge. Instead, I let Chloe's faltering words echo in the vacuum, let Robert's reassurance tremble under its polish, let the executives trade glances that grew heavier with every passing second. Margaret Ellis, 3 seats down, watched, like a surgeon observing an unexpected bleed in the middle of a procedure. Her eyes narrowed slightly as if filing away this data point, categorizing me under a label she hadn't used before. Dangerous, perhaps? Or useful? The laughter resumed, eventually brittle and strained. Someone forced a story about last year's ski trip, punctuating it with exaggerated gestures. Another cousin joked about football scores, his voice louder than necessary, but the ease had fractured. The performance could not be restored. I leaned back, folded my hands in my lap, and smiled, small, precise, the way a knife smiles when it catches light. I did not need to raise my voice, did not need to argue, did not need to explain. The silence was working for me. It pressed against Chloe's temples until sweat gathered at her hairline. It sat heavy in Robert's chest until he reached for his glass, too often trying to wash it down. It moved through the Henderson team until they regarded me not as an afterthought, but as a question mark they could no longer ignore. And so I stayed quiet. I let the silence choke them. That night I realized power doesn't need volume. It needs precision. Privilege hands you the spotlight, but it cannot teach you to stand the heat. The boardroom was polished to perfection, a cathedral of glass and steel rising over Manhattan. Light poured through the windows, bouncing off the glossy mahogany table that stretched like a runway for pronouncements of power. Every leather chair was filled, directors, senior partners, advisors, all waiting for the patriarch to speak. The air carried the scent of fresh coffee and too much cologne, an undercurrent of nerves disguised as order. Robert Carter sat at the head back, straight face carved into its usual granite mask. To his right, Chloe shimmered in a tailored cream suit, her hair perfectly coiffed, as though this morning had been staged for photographers. She smiled too often, waved at whispers no one had offered, rehearsing a role she thought was already hers. He began with gravitas, thanking the Henderson delegation for their ongoing trust, praising Carter Holdings for resilience in uncertain markets, his voice deep and deliberate. The directors murmured in approval, but when his gaze shifted toward Chloe, the room tilted. Today marks a new chapter, Robert announced, his palm flat on the table. The Henderson acquisition will be shepherded by our future leader, Chloe Carter. Polite applause filled the room, the kind that rose on command rather than conviction. The sound clapped against the walls and died quickly, leaving behind glances exchanged like currency. I caught the flicker in their eyes, Daniel Ruiz lowering his lids. Linda Park tilting her chin slightly toward me, another director fidgeting with his cufflinks as though distraction could mask doubt. I kept my expression neutral, my hands folded neatly, but inside I noted every hesitation, every reluctant smile. Power could be announced, but belief could not be commanded. Chloe leaned forward, eyes bright with the fever of recognition. She touched Robert's hand briefly, her nails gleaming under the light. "Thank you, Father," she said, her tone swelling with rehearsed confidence. "This company deserves bold leadership, and I intend to deliver it. Henderson will be ours, completely closed and consolidated within 90 days. The statement hit the table like a hammer on porcelain. 90 days. Impossible, reckless, maybe even fatal. A project of that size, with debt covenants and regulatory hurdles, required caution, months of due diligence, delicate handling of unions and international branches. 90 days was a dare to fate. A smattering of applause followed, louder than before, but just as forced. My gaze traveled across the faces again. Smiles that didn't reach the eyes, fingers drumming the polished wood. Margaret Ellis sitting 2 seats away, lips pursed in a half-smile that seemed almost private, and then her eyes flicked toward me. Barely a nod so small no one else would notice, but deliberate. It felt like a thread thrown across the void of that room, thin yet unbreakable. I straightened my back, inhaled, and said nothing. Chloe basked in the attention, convinced the room was hers. She didn't notice the way the director's eyes slid away from her, how they measured her against the weight of the promises she had just chained to herself. Robert smiled, thin as a blade. "You all heard it," he said, voice ironclad. "Carter Holdings will move swiftly. Under Chloe's leadership, we will show this city, this country, what real vision looks like." The applause came again, swelling dutifully. Chairs shifted, notebooks closed, pens clicked back into place. On the surface, it was settled. The air had been declared, the stage set. But in the silence beneath the clapping, in the space between each shallow smile, I heard it clearly. Doubt. It ran like a current under the table, pooling in the glances exchanged, in the way even the most loyal board members failed to meet Robert's eyes for too long. I leaned back, watching, memorizing, letting the faintest curl of a smile touch my lips. They thought they had chosen their leader, but the cracks were already showing. The boardroom applauded, but their faces said something else. They doubted her. Sometimes the heaviest weapon is the knowledge only you carry. The office tower stood in silence, its glass facade reflecting the December night. Inside, Carter Holdings felt less like a place of business and more like a mausoleum for ambition. Most lights had gone dark by now, but in the 24th floor, my office glowed faintly, papers scattered across the desk screens, casting pale light against the wood-paneled walls. The hum of the HVAC filled the silence, an indifferent lullaby for sleepless heirs. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the Henderson restructuring file spread before me. Each page was a labyrinth, clauses buried within clauses, timelines that pulsed like ticking bombs. Debt swap timing intertwined with compliance windows, obscure regulatory conditions tucked inside appendices. And there it was, again, the union carve-out, a small footnote that could shatter the entire deal if invoked incorrectly. The knowledge sat like a live coal in my chest. Everyone else saw a gilded prize. I saw a minefield. The cursor blinked on my laptop. Emails flooded in, Henderson executives pushing forward late into their own night. Subject lines stacked like accusations, collateralization terms, clarification. MAC clause, applicability and merger, compliance, timeline adjustment, all addressed to Chloe. None written in a way she would understand. The door clicked open behind me. Chloe flitted in perfume, chasing her presence, high heels tapping as if rehearsed for applause. She leaned against the doorway, phone in hand, screen glowing with a social media feed. "I'm meeting with Henderson again tomorrow," she chirped, brushing a lock of hair behind her ear. Margaret thinks my presentation style reassures them. I've got slides color-coded, streamlined. Dad says I'm Carter Holdings 2.0. She laughed at her own phrase. I nodded, keeping my eyes on the file. She mistook silence for approval. Her eyes fell briefly on the document spread across my desk. You're still reading that. Don't overthink it, Evelyn. This is about relationships, not whatever that is. She gestured vaguely at the dense legal text. Numbers will follow confidence. And confidence I have in spades. Before I could reply, she twirled back into the hall, her voice trailing about dinner reservations and interviews. The door shut, leaving her perfume behind. I exhaled, turning back to the screen. Henderson's latest email sat open. The wording was surgical, probing whether Carter Holdings fully understood the debt swap's implications if a material adverse change triggered in Q1. Chloe would never recognize the trap they were baiting us, testing whether the Carters had read the fine print. I drafted a response, fingers flying with precision. Every comma placed with intent, every phrase chosen to reassure without overpromising. I outlined compliance deadlines, referenced jurisdictional clauses, cited obscure precedents buried in financial law. My answers were exact, too exact. Anyone who read them would know I carried the blueprint in my head. But then I stopped. The cursor blinked against the half-finished draft. If I sent this under my name, the truth would be undeniable. If I sent it under Chloe's, she would stumble at the first follow-up. I deleted my signature, replaced it with hers, and hit send. Let her bask in the glow of expertise she didn't possess. Let her carry answers she couldn't defend. The clock ticked past midnight. My reflection in the glass looked back at me, tired, sharp-eyed, a ghost haunting her own inheritance. Margaret passed by the hall, once her heels muted on the carpet. She glanced in, pausing just long enough for her gaze to flicker toward the file on my desk, then back to me. Her expression betrayed nothing, but I knew she was storing this moment away, cataloging it with quiet precision. I gathered the loose papers, stacking them carefully, though my hands trembled from exhaustion. The knowledge weighed more than the marble building itself. I could end Chloe's ascent with a single email. I could preserve her illusion for another week, another month, until the walls inevitably collapsed. Then the notification flashed across my screen. A new email. Direct, without pleasantries, from Daniel Ruiz, Henderson Group. Subject: confidential discussion, message. We'd like to meet with Evelyn Carter privately. I froze, the words searing brighter than any neon sign. We'd like to meet with Evelyn Carter privately. The first crack in a polished mirror is invisible until it spreads across the glass. December light slanted through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Carter Holdings conference room, pale against the dark wood and glass. The room had been staged for importance. Crystal water pitchers, embossed leather folders at each seat, the family crest on the wall behind Robert's chair. But beneath, the polished tension pulsed like an exposed wire. Chloe swept in 10 minutes late, her heels clicking against the marble scarf still wrapped around her neck, as though she had rushed from a photo shoot rather than prepared for a billion-dollar negotiation. Her laughter was too loud, her apology too casual. Traffic, she offered breezily, dropping her designer bag on the table. Robert's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. His silence was meant as authority, yet it felt more like a dare, daring her to prove she deserved the spotlight he had thrust upon her. Henderson's team sat opposite us, their folders neatly aligned. Linda Park's eyes flicked briefly toward Chloe, then to her watch. Daniel Ruiz, more subtle, steepled his fingers and waited. Chloe began the presentation with a grin and slides that looked like marketing collateral rather than compliance briefs. Our vision for the Henderson merger is simple: synergy, growth, and innovation. We'll create a story the market can believe in. She waved her hand as buzzwords tumbled out, each more hollow than the last. Linda leaned forward, her voice crisp. That's inspiring, Ms. Carter. But about the grievance filed last week by the Transport Workers Union, How do you see that affecting the debt swap timeline? The color drained from Chloe's face. She shuffled her notes, glanced at her slides, then laughed lightly, too lightly. Unions are, well, they're stakeholders, of course, and stakeholders always want reassurance. So we'll reassure them. Her words fluttered like broken wings. She looked at Robert for rescue. He looked back, eyes cold, jaw clenched. Then her gaze slid to me. The pause stretched. I could feel every eye in the room turn toward me even though no one had spoken my name. I lowered my pen slowly, folded my hands, and answered. My voice was steady, factual, precise. The grievance triggers Article 14 of the Labor Covenant. Unless addressed within 30 days, it risks invalidating the compliance window aligned to the debt swap schedule. Our plan requires accelerated arbitration, ideally before January 5th, to avoid default risk. I spoke under Chloe's name as though explaining her intentions, but the air shifted. Henderson's executives leaned forward, pens moving across paper. Linda's brow eased in understanding. Daniel glanced sideways at her, his lips barely moving as he murmured, "She's the one keeping this afloat." Chloe nodded vigorously, parroting, "Yes, exactly what I was about to say." She flashed a smile, trying to reclaim control, but the room already knew. Robert's hands clenched the armrests of his chair. His smile remained for show, but his eyes found mine across the table. In that flicker of a glance, his mask slipped. Behind the tight curve of his lips was not pride, not acknowledgement, only the raw edge of doubt. And as his stare lingered, I realized something had shifted irreversibly. The crack had appeared faint but real, and it was spreading across the mirror he had so carefully polished. Silence can be loyalty, or it can be strategy. The morning after the Henderson meeting, the Carter estate glowed with winter light. The breakfast room was a theater of wealth, sun glinting off crystal glasses, china plates rimmed in gold, polished silverware set in perfect order. Yet beneath the gleam, the atmosphere carried a thickness that food could not soften. Robert sat at the head of the long table, his newspaper folded neatly beside him. Untouched coffee, cooling in a porcelain cup. Chloe, still in silk pajamas, dabbed at her eggs with disinterest, clearly nursing the bruises from yesterday's humiliation. The rest of the family filled the room with low chatter, cousins and uncles and aunts, mixing idle gossip with veiled barbs. At first, Robert said nothing. Then, with the weight of a patriarch who believed his words were law, he spoke. "Chloe, yesterday was not your best performance." His tone was cool, not sharp, but it carried the sting of disapproval. Chloe shifted uncomfortably, lips pressing together. Before silence could condemn her further, he added quickly, "But first impressions can be misleading. You have your mother's charm, and charm wins as much as numbers." It was an excuse dressed as praise, a shield given to her, not because she deserved it, but because he refused to let the room believe his chosen heir had faltered. One of my cousins, Andrew, whose smirk always carried the taste of condescension, leaned forward, voice carrying just enough for all to hear. "Funny how Evelyn only shines when Chloe stumbles. It's almost like she waits for her sister to fail." His fork clinked against his plate, punctuating the insult. I lifted my coffee cup slowly, deliberately, and let the bitterness of the brew steady my tongue. The instinct to retort burned in me, but I kept my lips sealed. Across the table, Margaret Ellis, the family's ever-watchful advisor, leaned toward me. Her whisper brushed the air like a secret too sharp to voice aloud. "Keep your silence. The storm will come. Let them choke on their own assumptions." I nodded faintly, more to myself than to her. My silence was no surrender, it was armor. The breakfast chatter resumed, shallow laughter covering deeper fractures. Chloe prattled about her plans, piecing together fragments she didn't understand, but Robert's gaze kept darting toward me. He was studying me, measuring something he could not yet name. Then, with deliberate calm, he set his cup down and addressed me directly. Evelyn. My name in his mouth was both an accusation and a warning. Don't overstep your role. Support your sister. That is your place. Every eye at the table turned toward me. The fire in my chest threatened to spill into words I could never take back. Instead, I let silence do the speaking. I met his gaze, unflinching, offering no rebuttal, no submission, only the quiet that unsettled him more than defiance ever could. The conversation limped on laughter, brittle forks scraping against porcelain. I excused myself with a polite nod and rose from the table. As I walked out, my phone vibrated in my pocket. I slipped it free, the screen lighting up with a single line that made my pulse quicken. Henderson requests a private call tomorrow. They think silence means weakness. But silence is strategy. When a client tests you in secret, they're already choosing sides. The elevator doors slid open with a muted chime, spilling me into the hushed corridors of Henderson Group's headquarters. Everything about the place spoke of discipline and calculation. The clean lines of glass walls, the silence broken only by the faint hum of ventilation, the scent of polished wood and leather. It felt more like a courtroom than an office, and I understood immediately this was a test. Linda Park, the COO, greeted me with a firm handshake, her eyes sharp, weighing me before I had spoken a word. Daniel Ruiz, the CFO, stood by the window, his posture relaxed, but his gaze no less piercing. They had not brought me here for pleasantries. Evelyn Linda began, her voice clipped. We'd like to revisit some of the terms discussed. Off the record. The phrase off the record was deliberate. It meant Robert and Chloe were excluded, and this meeting was mine alone to either falter or command. I felt the shift even before I sat down. Daniel leaned forward. Let's start with the MAC clause. If market conditions sour before closing, how would Carter Holdings honor the carve-out without triggering breach? The question was a blade honed to cut through bluff. I inhaled slowly, then answered with precision. You'd structure the collateralization under Section 2.49b, segregating the carve-out assets into escrow. That way, if the market collapses, the carve-out is insulated and Carter Holdings doesn't bleed into breach territory. Linda's brows lifted, faintly impressed, but she pressed further. And the escrow timing compliance requires certification within 30 days, yet Carter Holdings requested 45. An intentional misdirection, I said calmly. The real compliance window is OSHA, not SEC. 30 days is binding. I already redrafted the internal memo to reflect 30, though Chloe insisted on presenting 45. That discrepancy is logged in metadata. The silence that followed was not hostile, it was consideration calculation. I could feel the weight of their appraisal, the recognition that I wasn't parroting lines, but untangling knots they themselves had laid as traps. Daniel exchanged a glance with Linda, then asked quietly, and the union grievance. If arbitration drags past Q1, how do you secure Henderson's exposure? I folded my hands. Escrow won't protect you there. You'll need a standstill agreement binding both parties until arbitration concludes. It's already drafted, buried in Carter's compliance annex, but it hasn't been flagged to Chloe. If you want stability, insist she present it herself at the next meeting. That way, when she falters, you'll know exactly where the real work comes from. There was no smugness in my tone, only clarity. I wanted them to see what Robert refused to admit, that beneath Chloe's golden veneer, it was my quiet labor holding everything intact. Linda's gaze lingered on me, sharp but softened by something almost like respect. Then she said it plainly, the words landing with the weight of acknowledgement I had long been denied. You're the one holding Carter Holdings together, Evelyn. For a moment, the hum of the office seemed louder, the air heavier. Recognition from outsiders, not my blood, cut sharper than any family praise could have. I held her gaze steady, offering no gratitude, because to thank her would be to admit how much I had hungered for it. Daniel exhaled the faintest smile, tugging at his lips. His voice dropped, meant only for me. but your family will call you useless again tonight." The words weren't cruel, they were truth a mirror held up for me to see. And as I sat in that glass-walled office, I understood Henderson wasn't just testing me. They were watching, waiting to see if I would break free of the role my family had shackled me in. The first dinner scarred me. The second threatened to break me or sharpen me. By December 22nd, the Carter estate had been dressed for spectacle once more. Evergreen garlands lined the banisters, candles burned low in crystal holders, and the dining hall gleamed as though it had been polished not for celebration, but for war. The long mahogany table stretched beneath chandeliers heavy with light silver cutlery glinting like unsheathed blades. The scent of roasted game and winter spices lingered, but it was not enough to disguise the bitterness that hung in the air. This was the year-end board dinner, a ritual as old as Carter Holdings itself. Family sat interspersed with directors and advisors, the seats at the head reserved for Robert and Chloe. Henderson's delegation had been invited too, their presence both honor and threat. Linda Park sat with practiced composure, Daniel Ruiz a mask of stillness, their faces betraying nothing. Chloe basked in the spotlight as if the failures of earlier weeks had been erased by the glow of the season. She sparkled in a dress chosen to dazzle her laughter carrying down the table. With each glass of wine, her confidence swelled. She raised her glass high and announced, "The Henderson deal is practically closed. 90 days. No, I'll finish it in 60. Carter Holdings will enter the new year unstoppable." Applause followed, not thunderous, not sincere, but polite. Robert's pride filled the silence that the clapping failed to cover. He beamed at her eyes, shining with a father's conviction. "My daughter." He declared, his voice swelling the air to the Carter Empire. "The future." Margaret Ellis sat 2 seats from me, her expression unreadable, though I caught the faint narrowing of her eyes. She knew, as I did, that Henderson's quiet was louder than any applause. They did not nod. They did not raise their glasses. They watched. The evening pressed forward, course after course, laughter coating the room in false warmth. Chloe leaned forward, eager to impress, her voice pitched too high with intoxicated confidence. "Compliance strategy is simple," she said, cutting into her steak as if it were the contracts themselves. "The MAC clause is irrelevant once escrow opens. And OSHA. That's a health thing, it doesn't even touch mergers. We've got all the windows we need." The words struck like glass shattering. The directors exchanged faint glances. Margaret's hand froze around her fork. Even Robert's smile flickered. My wine glass rested near my fingers, poised, the same gesture I had made weeks ago at Thanksgiving. I didn't lift it. I didn't need to. My silence was a blade sharper than any argument. Across the table, Linda Park placed her napkin down with deliberate care. She turned her gaze to Chloe, her tone steady, polite, lethal. "Then, Chloe," she said, her words cutting through the festive air, "answer Evelyn's Thanksgiving question again." The room stilled. Forks lowered, conversations halted, and all eyes turned toward Chloe, who suddenly looked as though the spotlight had grown unbearably hot. The silver cutlery gleamed. My wine glass waited, and I felt the edges of humiliation turn at last into something sharper, something mine. Sometimes the sharpest blade is the one you never draw. The question lingered in the candlelit air like a guillotine suspended above the table. Linda Park had spoken it with perfect composure, her tone polite, yet merciless. "If Henderson demands collateralization on the debt swap and invokes a MAC clause, who signs off the union carve-out?" The words were familiar. My words, the ones I had first spoken at Thanksgiving. I felt the weight of the room tilt toward Chloe. Her smile faltered, her knife pausing mid-slice over untouched lamb. She looked around the table as though the answer might be written on the faces of our guests. Her voice cracked under the silence. "Well, the carve-out would fall under escrow authority, of course, and the compliance officers would..." She trailed off, fumbling, stringing together half-remembered phrases, her hands trembling slightly as she lifted her glass. Robert cleared his throat, stepping in, his voice filled with forced confidence. "The issue of collateralization is merely a formality," he said, peppering his answer with jargon that meant nothing in context. "Carter Holdings has multiple signatories who can ensure stability. Chloe is perfectly capable of navigating those terms." His words rang hollow echoes of authority, trying to mask ignorance. Henderson's delegation did not nod. They did not affirm. They only watched, their silence louder than any rebuke. Daniel Ruiz leaned back, pen tapping against his notepad, his eyes briefly meeting mine before sliding away. I felt Margaret's gaze on me, but I did not move. I let my wine glass rest on the linen, its base making the faintest sound as it touched the tablecloth. A subtle strike. I smiled faintly, not in cruelty but in certainty. My silence was not weakness, it was strategy. Chloe was collapsing under the weight of her own borrowed crown, and I had no need to deliver the blow for her. Chloe stammered again, desperately trying to recover. "The MAC clause doesn't really apply to Henderson because we're exempt under." Linda Park closed her notebook with a soft but decisive snap. The sound was final, like a verdict delivered. "We will reconsider our contract terms," she said, her tone courteous yet stripped of patience. A ripple moved down the table, shifting chairs, uneasy glances, the sudden stillness of those who realized a tide was turning. Robert's smile froze, brittle as glass. Chloe sat pale, her hands tightening around her fork, as if it might anchor her to dignity. I sat composed, my glass untouched. Now silence wrapping around me like a cloak. I had drawn no blade, spoken no word, yet the strike had landed all the same. As we rose from the table, Margaret stepped beside me. Her voice was low, meant only for my ears. "They've already chosen you." The words rang in me like a bell reverberating beneath the surface. The blade had never needed to be drawn. It had already cut. When a client stops asking questions, they start drawing lines in the sand. December 27th arrived with the kind of gray light that seemed to dim the world itself, and as I stepped into Henderson's headquarters, the mood matched the weather. The boardroom was all glass and steel, modern and merciless, walls transparent, but the atmosphere suffocating. The table stretched like a runway, papers neatly stacked, screens glowing with numbers that had already been weaponized. Henderson's executives sat waiting, their expressions sharp, their patience thinner than the winter daylight. Chloe entered just behind Robert, clutching her leather folder as if it might shield her from what was about to happen. Robert's charm preceded him. He greeted the room with smiles that fell flat against Henderson's stone-faced team. I slid into my seat quietly, feeling the tension pulse in the air. Linda Park opened the meeting with no pleasantries. "We've reviewed the compliance submissions," she said, her voice steady, clipped. "There are errors, glaring ones. OSHA requirements ignored. Debt swap collateral left undefined. Filing deadlines missed." She slid a file across the polished table, the pages marked in red. "This is not acceptable." Robert leaned forward, hands clasped, tone smooth with rehearsed authority. "Every major deal faces minor setbacks in documentation," he said. "Carter Holdings has the resources to ensure full compliance. Chloe will have the Henderson project back on schedule before year-end. You have my word." Chloe nodded too quickly, her voice higher than it should have been. "Yes, everything is on track. I've spoken to the teams, we'll adjust. Nothing is off course." She avoided Linda's eyes, fumbling to sound confident, her folder trembling faintly against the table. Daniel Ruiz tapped his pen once, then set it down with precision. "We've heard promises," he said. His gaze swept from Robert to Chloe, and then paused, lingering on me. "But promises don't satisfy regulators, and they don't protect our capital." Robert's jaw tightened, his smile thinning. "You'll have the Carter assurance. Our name means stability." Linda cut across him, her patience gone. Mr. Carter, this isn't about your name. Deliver a binding plan in 48 hours, or the contract ends. No extensions, no excuses. Her words fell like stone into water, the ripples shaking even the most composed faces around the table. Silence spread. Chloe's lips parted as though she might protest, but no words came. Robert shifted in his chair, his confidence visibly eroding, though he masked it with another thin smile. Then Daniel Ruiz leaned back, folding his arms. His eyes locked on mine with quiet certainty, bypassing the others as though they were already irrelevant. We expect the right person to deliver it. The weight of his words sank into the air, undeniable, undeniable, even to Robert, who bristled beside me. My pulse thundered in my ears. I could feel Margaret's unseen nod behind me, though she wasn't here. Her voice in memory reminding me that silence could be strategy, but sometimes strategy required precision. The meeting adjourned, Henderson's team leaving their ultimatum behind like a loaded gun on the table. We rose in brittle silence, the scrape of chairs against the floor the only sound. Robert caught my arm in a grip that felt more like chains than family. His hiss burned hot against my ear. Don't you dare overstep me. Dynasties don't collapse from enemies outside, they rot from arrogance within. The December night pressed against the windows of the Carter estate, the winter dark so heavy it felt like the house itself was suffocating. The family council convened in the library, a chamber meant for quiet study, but repurposed for our private wars. Oak-paneled walls loomed over us, portraits of long-dead Carters glaring down, as if they too disapproved of what was about to unfold. The fire in the hearth crackled but did nothing to warm the room. Chloe was already unraveling. Her hands shook as she clutched her wineglass, eyes wide with the desperation of someone who knew the walls were closing in. She sabotaged me. She cried, her finger stabbing toward me like a dagger. Evelyn planted traps in those documents. She made me fail in front of Henderson. Robert stood beside her, tall and stern, his face carved into disdain. His voice carried the heavy authority that had always silenced others in this family. Do not mistake your place, Evelyn. Remember who feeds you, who put a roof over your head. Without me, you'd be nothing. His glare could have burned through stone, but I met it without flinching. Alan Whitmore, the family's longtime lawyer, stepped forward with impeccable calm. He produced a folded letter from his leather briefcase, the kind of paper that carried more weight than its ounces suggested. He laid it on the table with a crisp snap. Cease and desist, he announced. Accusations of leaking confidential information to Henderson representatives. You are to withdraw from all Carter Holdings matters effective immediately. His tone was practiced, bloodless, the way only a lawyer could deliver a threat dressed as procedure. I unfolded the letter, scanning the words. Every line dripped with accusation, but none with evidence. My heartbeat slowed, not quickened. For the first time, I felt clarity rather than fear. I let the silence hang longer than comfortable before raising my eyes to the table. You can't erase metadata with threats. My voice was steady, cutting through the heavy air like a scalpel. Chloe's face flushed crimson. Robert's lips pressed thin, the muscles in his jaw tightening. The portraits above seemed almost to lean closer, as if savoring the spectacle of their descendants tearing one another apart. The room shifted uneasily, the extended Carters whispering, cousins exchanging wary glances, their loyalty tested in real time. For years, I had thought justice had to be loud, that to fight back meant shouting over them. Tonight, I understood something different. Power could be patient, precise, a strike waiting in silence until the moment came. The fire snapped, a log collapsing into ash, and Margaret Ellis finally moved. She had been quiet until now, her presence a shadow at the edge of the table. But then she reached into her satchel and pulled out a leather folder worn at the corners but unmistakably deliberate. She set it down with the gentleness of someone placing explosives. Her eyes met mine, then swept across the table to Robert and Chloe. Then let's see whose fingerprints are really on Henderson's plan. The room stilled, The flames crackled, and in that heartbeat of silence, I knew the dynasty had begun to rot from the inside. Paper cuts deepest when the ink is truth. The ballroom, once a place for glittering galas and hollow toasts, had been transformed into an arena. Long tables stretched beneath crystal chandeliers, their polished surfaces bare except for scattered documents and untouched silver cutlery that gleamed dully in the winter light. This was no celebration. It was a trial. The Carters filled one side of the room, Robert rigid at the head, Chloe pale but defiant at his right, the rest of the family scattered like spectators at an execution. Across from us sat the Henderson delegation led by Linda Park and Daniel Ruiz, their expressions unreadable, their patience already tested. The family shareholders lingered in the corners, whispering like vultures circling a carcass. And between the factions stood Margaret Ellis, calm and deliberate, holding the leather folder that had ignited the previous night's storm. When she opened it, the sound was louder than it should have been, echoing through the cavernous room. The Henderson Blueprint was authored in August 2023. She began, her voice steady. Not by Chloe Carter and not by Robert Carter Sr. Every digital draft, every metadata stamp, every tracked change points to one author. She placed printouts on the table pages, bristling with highlighted trails. Evelyn Carter. Robert's hand slammed against the armrest of his chair. Fabrications, doctored files. His voice reverberated desperate thunder. But Henderson's legal counsel was already on their feet, laptops open, verifying the files against their own internal archives. The silence of keystrokes filled the ballroom. Then came the quiet affirmation. Timestamps align, digital signatures are authentic. This work is Evelyn Carter's. The words landed like a blade. Chloe's breath hitched audibly, her lips moving without sound before collapsing into stammered protest. That's impossible. I presented the strategy. She must have stolen. No, Daniel Ruiz interrupted smoothly, his voice like steel wrapped in velvet. You recited a strategy. But strategies without comprehension are just empty words. Evelyn built this. Robert's face flushed a dangerous crimson, his sputtered objections tangled in the heavy silence that followed. Around him, board members leaned toward one another, whispers mounting. Some eyes widened with the thrill of watching a dynasty crack. Others hardened, calculating where their loyalties might land when the dust settled. Margaret slid one final page across the table, Henderson's review notes from August. Every response line corrected by Evelyn, every legal clause tightened. There is no ambiguity here. For a moment, the world held its breath. Then Linda Park rose, her voice carrying the force of inevitability. Our contract stands only if Evelyn Carter leads. Without her, there is no deal. The chandeliers trembled faintly, as if even the crystals shuddered with the weight of her decree. Robert, for all his bluster and power, sagged visibly in his chair. His lips parted, and for the first time in my life, his voice cracked not with authority, but with desperation. Then, Evelyn, will you save us? Sometimes victory is not accepting the throne, but naming your own price. The private chamber smelled faintly of cigar smoke and desperation. The walls, paneled in dark oak, seemed to lean inward with the weight of what was about to unfold. A single contract folder lay open on the polished table, its blank signature lines glowing like a trap. Robert sat stiff-backed at the head, his cufflinks catching the dim light, his face drawn, but still struggling to project command. Across from him, Linda Park and Daniel Ruiz remained composed, almost indulgent, as if watching a play whose ending they had already read. And I sat between them, all pen poised, no longer the quiet daughter, but the fulcrum on which this empire teetered. Robert's voice cracked as he tried to gather his remnants of authority. Evelyn, you've made your point. Carter Holdings is bleeding, but it doesn't have to die. I am prepared to bring you back as senior partner. The title, the office, everything that should have been yours, Step back into the fold. His words echoed in the chamber like an offering made to an altar he no longer controlled. I looked at him for a long moment, letting the silence stretch until even Linda arched a brow. Then I leaned forward. I already have an offer, I said evenly. Henderson has asked me to become Director of Corporate Restructuring, a position with autonomy, authority, and none of the Carter theatrics. My words struck like glass against stone. Robert flinched, his jaw tightening, but he held his tongue. Daniel Ruiz's lips curved in a small, knowing smile. She's telling you the truth. We meant it. I tapped the folder on the table, the sound sharp and deliberate. But I'm not here to burn the estate down, not yet. I'm here to lay terms. My pen hovered over the page as I spoke, each syllable measured like a surgeon cutting flesh. I'll save Carter Holdings. I'll deliver the compliance plan Henderson requires, but I will not rejoin as a partner. I will work as a consultant. $500 an hour, 6 months of exclusivity. And most importantly, a no interference clause. You keep your distance. I answer only to Henderson and the board's deadlines, not to family dinners, not to you. The chamber chilled. Robert's face drained of color, his knuckles whitening around the armrest. He opened his mouth once, twice, like a man gasping for air, but no words came. Finally, with the barest rasp, he whispered, "You'd charge your own family." I met his eyes. This family called me useless. Now it's time they learn how expensive uselessness can be. The contract seemed to grow heavier as I pressed my pen to the page, the scratching of ink, a verdict written louder than any courtroom gavel. Robert's eyes widened as if each stroke carved away another piece of his authority, leaving him small in the very room where he once towered. Linda Park exchanged a glance with Daniel, and both executives inclined their heads in quiet acknowledgement. The balance had shifted irrevocably. Your family called me useless. Let's see how expensive uselessness can be. Justice delayed is not justice denied, it is justice perfected. The new year dawned cold and brilliant over Manhattan, the skyline a jagged silhouette of steel and glass that seemed sharper than ever. From the window of my new office at Henderson headquarters, I watched the city churn below a sea of ambition and ruin, victories and failures hidden behind those glittering facades. For the first time, I wasn't looking up at the towers in envy or defiance. I was looking down, settled in a space carved by my own precision. The office was spare, still new, but it bore the quiet weight of permanence. The glass walls reflected my movements as I unpacked only the essentials: files, a fountain pen, and one framed sheet of paper. The memo that had unmasked the truth, that had exposed metadata like fingerprints no one could erase. It was the first object I set upon the desk, angled, so the morning light touched its surface. My proof. My justice. News clippings already circulated through financial channels: Carter Holdings saved through Henderson restructuring. Carter dynasty reputation in tatters. My family's empire survived on paper, but its foundation cracked too deep to mend. Robert's face appeared in photographs, aged 10 years in a week, the once commanding patriarch, now a shadow presiding over a hollow name. Chloe disappeared from the headlines altogether. Her resignation was filed in silence, no grand farewell, only whispers of a retreat into obscurity. The golden child tarnished her light, extinguished by her own arrogance. Margaret stepped into my office that afternoon carrying a slim notebook and the same wry half-smile she'd worn the night she placed the leather folder on the council table. "Your kingdom looks different than theirs," she said, glancing around the sleek walls and polished floor. "It's not a kingdom," I replied, turning from the window. "It's a platform. One where no one can dismiss my voice, not anymore." She nodded approving, then gestured to the framed memo. "That belongs there. Reminders are sharper than crowns." I thought of the Carter dining hall, its long mahogany table, the gleam of silver cutlery sharper than words, the place where I had been branded useless. I pictured the empty chair now left at its head, a throne no one could rightly claim. The image brought no bitterness, only closure. In the days that followed, my calendar filled with strategy sessions, compliance briefings, negotiations. Henderson trusted me not because of my name, but because of my precision. Every decision bore weight, but it was a burden I chose, not one imposed to humiliate me. They called me useless. One question changed everything, and quietly finished the job. Betrayal once silenced her, but truth gave her the final word, and the dynasty that mocked her crumbled under its own arrogance. The story proves that justice does not rush yet. When it arrives, it is sharper than any blade and heavier than any crown. When injustice is met with unwavering courage, the final verdict can echo through a lifetime. No wall of lies can stand forever against the tide of truth. If this journey moved you, like, share, subscribe, and leave your thoughts below. Comment 1 if you felt her triumph, or 2 if you believe justice could have gone further.